Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to AHSS Presents, a conversation with Jill Dawson. My name is Cassie Gorman, and I'm a senior lecturer in English literature within the faculty. And we're extremely excited to have Jill Dawson here with us today to talk about her life as a writer. So welcome, Jill. Jill is the author of 10 novels, including titles such as Fred and Edie, The Great Leather, Watch Me Disappear, and most recently, The Language of Birds, which focuses on the Lord Lucan case and was published in April 2020. She's been nominated for a number of awards for her writing, including the Orange Prize and Whitbread Novel of the Year, and she won East Anglian Book of the Year for her novel, The Crime Writer. She's also taught creative writing for many years and is the founder and director of the Gold Dust Mentoring Scheme for New Writers. Please note, as has been put into the chat, that the session today will be recorded, but rest assured that if your cameras are off, you will not feature in the recording of the session. If you ask a question, as we'd welcome you to, this will appear in the recording. If you do have any questions, please use the chat function, which you can find on your Zoom screen, and post your question there. I'll keep an eye on the chat during the event, and there'll be the opportunity to take questions from the audience at the end of Jill's talk. So without further ado, Jill, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope you can all hear me. Here I am in the Fens. I'm not sure where all of you are, but it's lovely to be here. I was invited to give a talk and it was quite open. So I chose my life as a writer, but also I chose a lovely quote from a poet called Eileen Myles. And the quote was, "Once I'd tasted time, I wanted more of it." Because I felt as if that was something that really resonated with me. And so I'm going to talk about how I sort of grew into the writer that I am, I suppose, how I became a writer from quite unlikely beginnings, but perhaps all writers would say that. And I'm hoping that among you this evening are writers, would-be writers, writers who wish they had more time to write, and perhaps just those interested in writing. So I'm sort of pitching it in that way. And I very much like, I must say, I've always liked the question and answer bit, and the bit where I get to talk to Cassie and I kind of find out what you would like to know rather than what I've decided I'm going to tell you. Okay, so I hope that's what you're expecting, and thank you very much for being here. Okay, well, once I tasted time, I wanted more of it. I can remember as a girl of about 7 or 8, I think, saying to my mum, "Why must I go to school?" I did not like having to go to a building every day that wasn't my home and not having my own time to do what I wanted. So I would have obviously been a child who'd been happily homeschooled or something like that, or one of those Summerhill, is it, you know, the really radical school idea where children just set their own agenda. Because I kept saying to my mum, I will learn and I will do my own reading. And I taught myself italic handwriting and I won a handwriting prize. And I taught myself yoga at the age of 12. That's a little bit further along. And, you know, I was actually quite good at teaching myself. I could not understand why my time was not my own. And I think that has been my number one saving grace, if you like, which is that I've had this concept of it as a very precious commodity. That, as Mary Oliver, the poet, said, you know, what are you going to do with your one wild and precious life? I felt that time was mine and I didn't want to spend it in things I didn't want to do. So my comments about time, and starting with time, is that I would say that if you are looking to have a life as a writer, if you would like to publish, be a professional writer, which is some of the things I'm going to be talking about, you might want to really figure out what it is that matters most to you. Is it money, security, a regular income, a structure in your day provided by others, somewhere to go, another building that isn't the home, a sense of approbation that's quite secure from others? If those things matter to you, then I would argue that being a writer, a freelance writer, as I've been my whole life, is possibly not for you. Because I have to admit that the current lockdown we all experienced was very familiar to me. I mean, that is basic my life. I wake up, there is nothing to do other than what I choose to do, which is write or arrange these days to mentor a student. You know, there's no external structure. And nothing gives me a greater joy than to feel that the whole day is mine. I often wake up and that's the first thing I write in my journal. I do something called morning pages, which you might know from a writer called Julia Cameron, The Artist's Way, highly recommend, which is just scribbling any old thing to kind of warm up first thing in the morning. And often the first thing I'll write is bliss, a whole day ahead of me to write. I don't think I've ever thought, what will I do with empty time? And when I work with students or mentees, as I call them, the writers that I mentor over a period of time when they're writing a book, there is often a great deal of complaint about the time that has to be given up to earning money or family or other considerations. So I do understand that that's a very difficult balance, and we will no doubt come back to it. And I imagine you will have questions for me about that one. But I just want to say that that was clear from me from the start, that I wanted to arrange my own life, and that although I went through the education system, I did go to university, I always balked at it. I did the absolute bare minimum and turned up for what was required to get the qualification that was needed. And it was my good fortune to actually spend some of my university life in America. I went to college in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and that I think has had a huge influence on my reading, my writing, and who I am as a writer, and recurs quite a lot in my work. Quite a lot of, I've also taught and lived in America, and quite a lot of my novels draw on that. But that's jumping the gun a bit. We're going back to me, age 7. I would say that the qualities a writer needs, one might well be this self-starting quality. You have to start the projects. Nobody's asking you for books. Nobody's got a gun to your head saying, write the next book. I mean, maybe that's the position J.K. Rowling's in. I doubt it, actually. I've never had that experience. It's always knocking at the door and waiting. And that is a big part of a writer's life, waiting. But I would say the second very early aspect of my personality was the desire to communicate, and not in a social or verbal way like this. I was both a private and a secretive person. My mum said secretive was the word she used, and it wasn't a compliment, who lost myself in books and reading and daydreaming and being on my own. And the wish to communicate was to communicate with a stranger, interestingly, which is what I think writing often is. So being published is something else, but the writing part was very much about being a solitary child, being a bookish child in quite a working class family. Neither of my parents went to university. They didn't have, I mean, I can say this now, huge aspirations for me. I was the first daughter to go to university, and I think it was still expected that I would just marry someone there and have some children, and that would be great. But then I would be familiar again, and I would be back to their world, and they would understand me. I think the idea of being a writer or an academic, an intellectual, any of those things would be as foreign could be to my family. So I think I don't really know where that part of me came from, except to say that, of course, it was reading. And the books I read, the world I lost myself in, was things like Laura Ingalls Wilder, Little House on the Prairie, a gorgeous series about homesteaders, if you don't know it. And my first novel, Trick of the Light, was described as, in one review, as Little House on the Prairie meets The Shining. Bit worrying, but there you go. But I think Little House on the Prairie went in quite deep. It's about a family living in a log cabin, which I did as a woman in my 20s and 30s in quite an isolated place with a small baby. And I've written very much about that landscape and about that solitary life. And also that was me slightly stepping aside from the world too. You know, I didn't want particularly to be part of all of that and have a career. I did want to be out in a wild place. And that's been a strong desire. So the first thing I ever wrote, which to send to a publisher, I wrote when I was 12, and sometimes when I'm doing these talks I show it because it was part of an Oxfam women and careers campaign or something, and my mum kept it, and it was a little book which I illustrated myself, but I bet lots of you did. So when I give this talk, I know that lots of people wrote in illustrated books when they were young. The mystery is why we lose our nerve, or why we don't think we can carry on with that. I put my name on the cover, I wrote it to the best of my ability, and I sent it to Hodder, which I think was very precocious, and I've no idea really where I got that idea from. Hodder said no, of course, so that was my first rejection, age 12. But interestingly, Hodder has been my publisher for the last 20 years. Sceptre is a literary imprint of Hodder. So they did become my publisher, ultimately, when I was 30-something. I think that first rejection was very good for me. My next point was going to be, what do we need as a writer? I think we need a very thin skin in order to be able to write well, especially if we're talking about fiction, poetry, memoir, anything at all that excavates the self. We need to be able to go in quite deep. But we need a thick skin to survive the publishing world, which to me remains quite a treacherous place, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that. So the two I think of as quite distinct. I've always loved writing, and I've never had a writer's block nor any difficulty finishing, starting, getting on with a writing task. Publishing a little bit more tricky, and as my very good friend Louise Doughty says, writing is what I do, publishing is what they pay me for. And I think that's quite an interesting distinction, that the very public part, which perhaps is what those who want to be writers are thinking about, I was a bit slow to catch on to that part. Might be difficult. But moving on, I did send another piece off, aged 14, and it was a poem, and I didn't hear anything. And I sent it to a magazine that no longer exists. Those of you a bit older might know of it, called Honey, girls' magazine from long, long ago. And one day I was in my local newsagent in Yorkshire, that's where I grew up, and picked a copy of Honey off the shelf. Lo and behold, there was my poem in it. They hadn't thought to tell me. And the interesting thing was I put the magazine right back on the shelf and left the newsagent with my heart pounding. It's like, oh, somebody's seen it. And I immediately had what comes up a great deal when I'm mentoring and teaching, which is the conflict between private and public, what we want to see, what we want to say, what we want to communicate, and what we don't. And I realized that that was never going to be straightforward, that being published isn't just unmitigated joy, as many of you will know, I'm sure. But the desire to do it continued. So I mentioned that I went to Nottingham University and did American Studies. I think it was a great stroke of luck that I didn't do English literature. Sorry, Cassie, and those of you teaching and studying it. I think for me it would have been very crushing, because at that time I had very little confidence and a very strong interest in vernacular voices, a Yorkshire accent, which my mum always likes to remind me I don't have anymore, and I'm so posh now. But I have lived in many different places. And the vernacular voices was very much influenced by Ronald Blythe's Aikenfield, which I read at 16. And Cassie mentioned my novel, The Crime Writer, which features Ronnie Blythe. He is a character in it. So much later in life, and there is a circularity often in writers' lives, I got to talk to Ronnie. I didn't meet him personally. I wrote to him about the impact that Aikenfield had on me. and the idea that you could do a kind of non-fiction-y book that had a narrative feel to it, which is very much what I write, books often investigating true stories and some kind of hybrid form. I just call them novels, but often when I give talks in different places, they might be called biographical fiction, let's say, or that hybrid idea, a bit Truman Capote in Cold Blood, the kind of looking at a real case. Again, that interests me greatly. And I think Aikenfield was where I got the first idea of how it might be done, because Ronald Blythe, if you don't know that book, it's a fantastic study of a village, of his village, not Aikenfield. He disguised it and made it up, the name, but it's very much his village. And interviews with people like the gravedigger, the midwife, the village nurse. And Ronnie interviewed them and then ventriloquizes, really, so that they speak. And I loved Aikenfield, and I loved the concept that instead of a singular authority, or a single authority is what I really mean, or a particular authority, you would have many voices, many different voices. That has always interested me. So I think my good fortune to read that novel at that age and then go to America and study American studies, so it was law, politics, it wasn't just literature, but the literature we did study happened to be a lot of African-American writers, people like Toni Morrison, who I absolutely adored and still do read and love, a writer called Ntozake Shange, who was a kind of poet and novelist, Tony Carter Bambara, was published by the Women's Press. So I was reading often poets and vernacular writers who were writing in a kind of often free-form, unusual styles, and that's what I was absorbing. So I think it's not that surprising that I moved on to poetry, and I won poetry and short stories. I won a short story prize when I was 22 and a poetry prize a few years later, and they were quite big boosts, because I must say, and this isn't really on my list, but it kind of should be, that I think if you're going to treat your time as a very precious commodity, and if you're not going to forfeit it working in Boots, which I did briefly work in Boots, and I couldn't last more than 4 weeks, and I also had a job in the Wetherby Turnpike, which was a pub, and I think I lasted 2 weeks. I mean, I just have never managed to hold down a job of any kind. I really have just somehow been outraged when people ask me to do things. But if that is who you are and how you want to live your life, then you might have to endure quite a lot of poverty, which I would say coloured my 18 to 30. You know, I signed on the dole. I did manage to qualify as a yoga teacher and teach some yoga. I wrote short stories for a magazine called Just 17. And I just found every which way to fund a freelance life. And that was going to be my next suggestion if you're interested in kind of being a freelance writer, is that you have to have a lot of strings to your bow. I mean, if in fact you're a very different disposition to me and you could hold down a sensible job, then hats off to you. And, you know, we have to work with what we have. I think that can work, although I also wonder about the idea of, again, how you make time for your writing in that scenario. What I had was a great deal of time in which to think, read, learn, and reading has always been a huge part of my life, and I have to have time for that. I actually get quite frantic if I don't. And I think that's something that many of my writing students don't make enough time for and don't value sufficiently. The reading doesn't just get fitted in around the edges. It has to actually be prioritized if you want to learn. So the sorts of things I was doing was sending stories to magazines, sending poetry to magazines, doing things like poetry readings. And I think this is still possible. I'm going to stick my neck out and think you still could do this now. But I wrote to a publisher and proposed the idea for my first book. And it was, I've got a copy of it here. So I can find out the date, because I'm not 100% sure. 1990 came out, but I was writing it in 1988, so probably before most of you were born. And the biography about me says Jill Dawson had her first poem published while at school, and in 1984 won a City Limits short story competition. At one time, she wrote fiction for Just 17 and Ms, again, defunct magazines, under the pen name Ruth Walker. Now, when I read that, I forgot that pen name entirely. I've had many, many pen names in my life. And just sometimes to protect myself, or because I was writing erotica for a big collection, or I just use different names. I think lots of writers do. But just occasionally I forgot about them. And back in the day, I used to get checks payable that I couldn't pay in to Ruth Walker. I can't remember what I did with that. A couple of years ago, she was Doncaster's writer in residence. I forgot that one. That lasted 2 months. She's now 27, works freelance, and lives with friends and her 8-month-old baby in Hackney. So along the way, I also had a baby and had to fit my time in around that. Now, this collection, School Tales, was me writing to the women's press saying, oh, I've read a lot of Mallory Towers and Enid Blyton, and all your stories are set in these, you know, wonderful boarding schools. But I went to a big comprehensive. What about some school tales about other kinds of schools? And the editor said, yes, good idea. Would you like to put them together? Which was more or less what I was proposing. So that became School Tales. So I then advertised it very excitedly. It didn't feel like a huge step. I mean, it's an awful, awful cover, a huge step beyond the ones I made myself, I have to say. But if I tell you that one of the first people who I included in here and who sent me a story was the writer Mallory Blackman. Now, Mallory went on to be the Children's Laureate, and Noughts and Crosses, I think, might be on telly at the moment. And Mallory went on to be a massive writer. And I was the first person to publish her in this. And when we finally met, she did say to me that she had my letter to her. She didn't know I was also quite young. We're the same age. She had it framed. But also in here is a writer called Joanna Briscoe, a young writer. There's quite a few writers who went on to publish. So I did feel that alongside my own writing, I had an eye for writing talent. And that's the part that has fed into my creative writing teaching. So the second book I did, and these ones are all out of print, again, another terrible cover, but there you go, that's 1990. How Do I Look? That's a non-fiction book, interviews with young women about self-image and things like eating disorders. It's very much of its time. Interestingly and quite controversially, there were 2 interviews with Muslim girls, one who wore a complete, well, actually, back in the day, we didn't call it hijab, or she didn't, Ijima, she was from Bradford. And she was talking about that very positively, and one who didn't. And I actually think that was 1990 or something. And it was something very interesting for me to go about the country interviewing women about how they felt about their looks, their bodies, how they dressed and why they dressed a certain way. Yeah, I mean, I imagine it's rather dated, and that's why I mentioned those 2 interviews. But it had quite a revealing introduction by me in it. So it was my first, I suppose, experience of writing about myself, writing non-fiction, and also dealing with publishers. So that one's Virago, and the one before that was the Women's Press. During that time, so that kind of covers, I suppose, 20s to early 30s, raising my son, living in America, teaching, doing bits and bobs of writing. I would say the next sort of significant stage for me was the master's that I did. So I came back to England in about 1992. And I decided I was going to train as a psychotherapist. I'd been having a lot of therapy. I was very interested in it. I enrolled to do it. And then I saw an ad for a new master's at Sheffield Hallam, and they were the same cost. And it was the exact same money that I'd got for editing the Virago Book of Wicked Verse, which was £4,000. And that's what the MA cost. And also that's what the psychotherapy training cost. And I sort of made a decision I would put that money into the MA. And I never regretted it. I know you have a fabulous MA. In fact, some of you might be there who teach on it, I hope, or students on it at Anglia Ruskin. And I really do think that did change my life, because for one reason, many reasons, but one was that I met my really dearest friend, Catherine Hayman, another novelist, on that course. I was taught by some fantastic writers, E.A. Markham, the poet, Jane Rogers, the novelist, Leslie Glaister, the novelist. I didn't especially like the workshop model, and never have done, and I'm very frank about that. And I think that relates to how I've described myself as a child, having very thin skin. I've actually written about the idea that I feel sometimes as if I'm really permeable, and things can get inside me and I can't fend them off. So in a workshop group, when there were 10 or 12 people with different thoughts and, you know, criticisms or suggestions about my novel, it just utterly bewildered me. And that may be why I didn't enjoy school either. You know, I think I am a little bit neurodivergent and have come to that understanding of myself. So I didn't like the workshop model, but I got so many other things from it, not least taking myself more seriously as a writer, having visitors from fantastic writers like Pat Barker, James Kelman, meeting other writers, which had been very much missing in my life. And I published my first novel as a result of my MA. So that's another reason I think I'm a great believer in them, because I think that they can give you the propulsion that you need. I got my first agent as a result of not strictly the MA. I have to say we did have agents come to talk to us, as I'm sure you do at Anglia Ruskin. But interestingly, the night we had Giles Gordon, a very famous agent, come to talk to us, I made sure I wasn't there because I was quite shy and thought it would be horrific. So it took me a while to get an agent. I actually found one through a friend of mine, my friend in Hackney, Bridget O'Connor, who I had included in a short story collection. So she was one of the first writers I ever met. And I asked her who her agent was. I'm sure you will have questions for me about how to find agents, and I've got many thoughts on that. But I think contacts is probably the easiest way in the world. So that's basically it. I sent it to her agent, and that became my first agent, Sarah Lee. She's not my agent anymore, but it was very easy, the first person I tried. I then, with Sarah Lee's help, got my first publishing deal, which was for Trick of the Light, my first novel. So I brought the novels so I could show you the covers. The covers do change over the years, but that was Trick of the Light. And that was the novel that was described as Little House on the Prairie meets The Shining. It is about a young woman living in a log cabin, very sort of terrified, if you like, by all the wilderness, by the bears, the wolves, the mountain lions, but unable to face the fact that it's the man she's with who she should really be afraid of, the violent man. So that was my first novel. Now, as Cassie said, there have followed 9 more, and in fact there are 10 more in that I finished one this week on Monday and submitted to my publisher. So I'm rushing forward now to kind of the present day, I suppose. And my publisher has remained Sceptre, the person who published the first novel I've had for 20 years. And I would say that if you're not going to have security in any other way, if you're not going to have, let's say, an academic post or something that you do part-time to enable you to write, then perhaps I've sought security in other ways. And one is not to change publishers. Other friends have changed publishers. I have been very, very fiercely loyal to my wonderful editor and felt very lucky indeed to have her. So I've no desire, I mean, I probably, or possibly one could get more money if you move publishers, because your agent can then negotiate more money for you. But I've always been really delighted to have a superb editor in Carol Welsh, and I've been, in a way, that's taken the place of the very last thing that I was going to mention, which is the idea that I think writers need mentors of some kind. And that doesn't have to be, I now run a mentoring scheme, as Cassie mentioned, which is quite a formal scheme. It's expensive. It's like doing an MA. It's time sensitive. You do it for 1 year or 2, depending which course you choose. It's formal in the sense of you have monthly meetings, you have deadlines to meet. So that's quite a structured course. But I've also written about the fact that, as you heard there, for me as a child, there was no example of a writer. Nobody in my life, nobody I knew. And the first one I ever met probably was Bridget O'Connor at some party in Hackney. So we all lived in squats and were part of a kind of a particular scene of young people trying to be creative and live differently. I mean, the flat I lived in with my baby, I did actually give, I don't know if I should say this, it's my grown-up son now, be very embarrassed to know, they did sort of give birth with all my friends around and a kind of midwife on tap. It was that kind of time and world. Back then. So Bridget was part of that world. So she felt familiar to me. Whereas I've always had a stab of absolute envy whenever I hear writers say, well, of course, there can be problems involved, but, you know, Martin Amis, having Kingsley Amis as the father and having the most wonderful stepmother in Elizabeth Jane Howard, you know, and being able to talk to other writers. That was what I craved, and it was what my master's in Sheffield gave me. And so now I suppose I understand that that might be a role that others would value. And I think part of that is trying to model for others how they manage the sorts of things I've talked about, which is this trying to find the time to write, trying to find the income and source of income that could support your writing. So just to quickly say, before I let Cassie move to questions and see if you have some for me, I hope, that alongside the writing, I did start teaching creative writing quite early, just in piecemeal ways. So often it's mentioned that I taught at the University of East Anglia on the MA, which I did. And I've also taught at Bath Spa on their MA in creative writing. And I've been an external examiner for a couple of PhDs in different universities, but I've never had a proper post. So these are always over, let's say, a year, 2 hours a week, that kind of thing. So they haven't necessarily given the secure income that might be required, but they have given other things, such as an office sometimes, to be really straightforward about it. At UEA had the most fantastic library that I used for one of my novels, Wild Boy. And I realized that I wasn't someone who enjoyed the admin, marking. I might have thought I could manage those things, but they're not really for me. But what I have always loved is talking to writers, young writers, new writers. Actually, a lot of my mentees are not necessarily young. I tend to work with people who have wanted to write for a very long time and are now permitting themselves. But that is what I love to do. So really the life I always wanted, the writer's life that I started off by speaking of, was kind of having time to read, write, think about writing, be part of a writing scene, I suppose, where other friends are writers, where they care about books, where we can not find it strange or pretentious to discuss books, you know, in a way that would have not been so acceptable in my family, where it wasn't the kind of family where we debated, you know, things. That was very much frowned upon. So I think that is what I have wanted, and that is very much now, I would say, how things are. I consider myself a full-time writer, although I do the mentoring 1 day a week. The rest of the time is writing. Monday is reading day, which is lovely lovely. Especially this year, I was a Costa Prize, or the year just gone, I was a Costa Prize judge. So I did have 40 novels to 140, but we had to narrow it down to 40, then to 12, etc., etc. So I had a lot of reading to do, which was, I think, much harder for other people who didn't have that allocated time and weren't in the habit of taking reading seriously. Anyway, that's enough waffling on, I think. I hope that gives some kind of sense of what that life might be. But now I'd love to know, Cassie, what you wanted to ask me about.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, inspiring talk, Jill, and just such a beautiful reflection on the environment of being a writer and on time. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, so do put them in the chat, everyone, as you're thinking of questions. I've got quite a few around the writing process and the research process for that matter. But just before I get into those, I can't resist asking about your new novel. Congratulations. I mean, that's such a recent submission. Congratulations.
It really is. I'm feeling very, very sort of vulnerable and strange about it because only one person has read it. And that's my husband. He's always my first reader. It's always him, then Carol Welsh, my editor, then my agent, in that order. And the reason my agent is last is she might need to arbitrate, you know, and if everybody reads at the same time, then people's willingness to read a new draft is limited. So I've always had that pattern. I often change quite considerably after my husband's read it, which I did this time. So the new one is called The Bewitching. It will come out May next year, I think, or April or June, you know, according to the publisher's deadlines, not mine. It is set here in the Fens again, and it is based on a true story, a witchcraft story. It's not a very well-known one, and I think for now I'm not going to say too much about it. I always like to keep my powder dry when I'm writing. And also, I think what's up ahead of me when the book comes out is a great deal of talking about it. That's always the case. So I think it's quite nice to just for a little while stay in that place of it's done for the moment. We'll see. My editor will definitely have some input, so that isn't the final draft. Yeah, there'll be more work to do.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, very much looking forward to reading it, and The Bewitching, a wonderful title as well. And actually that leads on to a question I wanted to ask, which was about a lot of your work responds to that fenland landscape or the landscape of East Anglia, Sussex, Norfolk, and so on. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about how that landscape inspires you, as it's often in your work, it's a character in its own right. It seems it's such a strong presence.
It is a very powerful influence for me to live here, and I'm always surprised by how little people know about the Fens. I mean, they often know Waterlands, a fantastic Graham Swift novel. But recently we went to the Cambridge and Oxford boat race here, and on the news they were going on about how remote it was. I think it's an hour and 15 minutes on the train. Londoners, you need to get out more. You know, it's not the Isle of Mull. So that quite amused me, but I suppose I had the same ignorance when we moved here from London, from Hackney, East London. You know, you sort of go up the M11 and we built a house here. My husband's an architect, so we were looking for land, and that's really why we chose this area. We did a circle between our parents and where they lived. So I must admit I was equally ignorant. But the second I arrived, I loved it, and I had a very strong response. And the only other place I felt that about was the landscape in Trick of the Light, which was Washington State, very close to Canada, utterly different, mountains, trees. So this is famously, isn't it, flat, empty, rather unlovely, I think of it in a good way. I actually think that's a positive. And I think it has a feeling quite often for me of sort of Badlands America. I don't have to go far. I'm not going to name the places, but when my son, another son, was little, I used to drive him to try to get him off to sleep. And you would get out into some quite odd places very quickly that just had a tumble down shack and just you know, some birds and a feeling of emptiness. And it's that which appeals. And I think for a writer, it's like a blank page, you know, it's like into this emptiness, you want to imagine things. And I suppose it's not peopled by others, and it's not chocolate boxy. I did grow up and lived in, well, I lived in many different places, but I did mention Yorkshire, and Yorkshire is very beautiful, of course, but it is all sort of, you know, all creatures great and small, and kind of rolling hills. The Fens feels quite rightly underpopulated. It is, and not at the moment. I mean, some might argue that I'm part of that journey, but not at the moment colonised by townies. You know, the street I live on still has 3 generations of one family in it, which is interesting. And actually, when I moved here and wrote a novel that had the view to Ely Cathedral that I can see, someone wrote to me who'd lived exactly on my street, who'd written a novel also, and couldn't wait to get away from here. He'd hated it as a boy, living on this street. So that's quite interesting.
Wonderful, and I love the way you put it about the you know, into this emptiness. You kind of want to imagine things, and it's sort of it fills up with feeling. I think that's a really beautiful way of putting it. I also found that BBC News article hilarious. The way I was like, hang on, it's so close to London. Why haven't people been to Ely? But anyway, I can see there's quite a few questions that have come up in the chat, and there's 2 about publication and 1 about teaching. So I might take the 2 about publication first. So a question from Nick Caddick, who mentions his niece is an aspiring writer and would like to know whether it's best to use an agent to get published. And maybe a connecting question from Andy, who asks, any advice on maintaining a good relationship with your agent?
I do recommend getting an agent. My own path of doing 6 books without an agent was very different once I got one, you know, because they can negotiate, they do have the contact, they do know the publishers. So it's still possible to simply send work out. And I can think of instances, and sometimes editors will ask for submissions and you can just send in. But the thing I often say to students is, if someone said, oh, we're offering you 30,000 for all world rights, including film, or 17,000 for British and Commonwealth only without film, which is best? What is the answer? Everyone blanks over. And in fact, there's no simple answer. You really need a conversation with your agent about what both of those things mean. And it's not just about the sums of money, it's about which rights you're giving away. And even that's not obvious, because sometimes it is better for your publisher to have the rights. So having learned that it is complicated, I have and do highly recommend trying to get an agent. So this is for your niece, for the question, Nick. But it's not as if it's a straightforward thing to simply get an agent. There's usually a great deal of rejection along the way. And the route of the Writers and Artists Yearbook isn't, which is always suggested, that's where you find agents, is often quite a difficult one, because who on earth do you pick and how? On the Gold Dust website, which I'll add into the chat, we do have an agent showcase page. And on there are all the agents who, over the time that I've been mentoring, have been nice enough to take one of my mentees' work. You know, so they've published someone in our scheme. So I know they're open to debuts. So that's why they're on there. And for example, we have sort of really big names like Peter Strauss, or new young agents, or people who've won Agent of the Year. So it's a good list, I think. It's a good place to start. So I'll pop that in the chat in a moment. As for the good relationship with one's agent, I've had 5 agents, and I only fired one of them. The other one of them kept getting made redundant, and I kept going back to her, not realizing she wasn't particularly perhaps very committed to her job, and she did finally move away. One agent got pregnant and left. You know, I think changing agents isn't the end of the world, actually. And Maintaining a good relationship. Well, I'll probably, I mean, this is being recorded, so I should be careful here, but I think an agent isn't your best friend. An agent is the person who represents you to the literary world. They should be good at selling, at contracts. They should have a strategy for your, how to market you. But I've never rung my agent in tears or confided in her late at night. That's not, to me, the right professional relationship. I have other writer friends for that. That's who I would do that with. But I suppose everyone different. It's different in that regard. I do have one friend who's very published, something like 17 novels, and she did really need her agent's ear in that way. But that wouldn't be my idea of what an agent did. And I think it might be worth thinking about that, about what an agent is, what their job is, how they represent you. If you thought of yourself as, let's say you were an actor and you're going up for a job and you didn't get the part because they decided they want someone older, younger, fatter, whatever, blonder. You would still expect your agent to then put you up for another job. You wouldn't sort of think that was the end of it. And quite often what I find with my new writers is they're very wedded to this one novel that they've written. And if that one doesn't happen, they do find it really difficult to think of themselves as having a longer writing life, where they might write something else and the agent or a new agent be successful for them.
Thank you. No, thank you. And that's a lot of food for thought for aspiring writers in the audience. I think following up on that, I'll come back to the questions from Amber in Geneva. As Colette's put in the chat something that I think connects as we're talking about the publication world and the literary world. Colette's asked about the idea of the pram in the hall being the enemy of good art, or more broadly, whether you've had experience or not of sexism in the literary world.
Yes, very interesting. Well, as you heard there in my talk, I did have a baby relatively young, I suppose. 27 is considered quite young now, not in working class families where I come from, but I think people tend to get their education out the way first and then have their children. Then I had another one at nearly 40. And then I adopted a third, not contented, at 52. I have a foster daughter. So I spaced my children out, making it ever more inconvenient, if you like, as in there was always something very demanding. Because I don't at all agree with that pram in the hall quote. Is it Cyril Connolly, I think? I've got the book on the shelf somewhere. I read it recently, the essay, because I was invited to take part in a debate. But I think one of the reasons I felt so strongly that it was possible to do both, have children, be a writer, was that the sorts of writers I were reading had managed that. Toni Morrison, Margaret Atwood. There was a bunch of women that were publishing in sort of the 80s as I was. Alison Fell, she had a son. It was reading all these writers that made me feel it was possible. And if I had studied English literature, which as you heard I didn't, and really only been reading, I don't know, Virginia Woolf, or I didn't read Virginia Woolf till I was 40. I mean, I'm very glad I finally did. But she wasn't part of the curriculum on my degree. So many women writers did not have children. And there was a feeling that the two things were quite separate. And also, of course, all the male writers, but also those who did have children. I think Charlotte Bronte finally had a child and died in childbirth later. You know what I mean? So there was always such a disastrous version of what it might be to have children, whereas actually the topic of being a mother, being a parent, being a child, so parenting, and is very present in all of my novels and has always felt very ordinary to me. So in Trick of the Light, the young woman in it has a baby. In Magpie, the young woman in it has a 6-year-old. There's always, in my new bewitching novel, which is a bit like the Salem Witch Trials on speed, there's loads and loads of children in it, sort of all having fits, because actually my life has been surrounded by children. So I find it very enriching and have refused to see it, in the way that was expressed. Although I was very interested in reading, writers on that topic. At UEA, a friend and really a kind of a mentor was the novelist Michelle Roberts, who has been quite open about not having children for that reason, that she didn't feel she could kind of cope with both. So it is a really interesting, and actually Margaret Atwood's famous, is it Atwood? I think it is Atwood, who says just have one. With one you can move, with two you're a sitting duck. So the minute I'd had my second child, I thought, oh no, but I don't know, it depends how much seems to me in all aspects, in every other career for women, that plays its part, doesn't it? And it's and women deal with it in different ways. For the other question about sexism, yes, it's the short version. Yes, I'm sure I have. One of the things that used to annoy me the most was being on panels with other women writers where we had nothing in common whatsoever. Nothing about our work made sense. But they thought some women writers, they can talk about being women writers. And so once at UEA at a conference, there was a panel of 4 men, and I can't remember all who they were. I think it was chaired by Andrew Cowan and involved, their names will come back to me. One of them I knew, not the others. And I said to them, how is it being a man writer? Because the question had been asked to me so often. And of course, they had never been asked it ever in any of their careers. And only one of them answered it well. I think it was Harry Consroe, possibly. But he spoke about being a father, not a man writer, if you like. Being a man writer is just being a writer. In fact, I deliberately say a man writer rather than a male writer, because I'm so often called a woman writer, which I find odd. A strange kind of phrase. So I like to say men writers, just to show you how odd it is. I've often, I'm really pleased. Another reason I love my editor. So the little stable I'm in at Sceptre includes David Mitchell, not the telly personality, but, the writer, Andrew Miller, Tom Keneally, Siri Husvet, me, a few others. And as you can hear from that, that's quite a mixed bunch. That's who my editor loves, a range of writers. She must see or find something in each of us, because she's kept us all for a long time too. We're also loyal to her. And that has pleased me, I suppose, because within that, it's a bit like, so I've written about deafness or deafhood, in one of my novels, Wild Boy, and it's a little bit in the new one, and I am partially deaf in one ear now, but I wasn't at the time I was writing about it. And I had deaf friends, and when I went to a deaf school in Paris, I can remember one of them saying to me, it's so brilliant not to be the deaf person. Here I'm the one who likes, a particular kind of music. That's who I am. So I think equally that's my issue with being a woman writer on the panel. That might not be the thing I have in common. It may well be the fact that I'm writing some kind of historical narrative exploration that has more in common with Andrew Miller, let's say, as I've always felt.
You can expose the banality of the labels, and as you say, by just saying man writer. And I have to say, it sounds like a wonderful community of writers with your editor as well. What a wonderful community to be part of. I think going back in the questions a little bit, so Amber was asking about your teaching opportunities and whether you sought them out or whether they came to you. And perhaps on that note as well, because I'd heard earlier from you that you've just set up a new online course as well, and maybe this would be an opportunity to reflect on that further, introduce that.
Right, yes. Well, I did mention there that I trained as a yoga teacher. And when I'd finished yoga teaching, I did think about, well, not finish yoga teaching, sorry, finish the training. I did think about teaching in a different way, as something. If you think about yoga teaching, what does the teacher do? They stand up the front and they model for you, more or less. This is what you do. You raise this, and in fact, you have to learn to do it like a mirror. So you say to the student, raise your right arm, but you're raising your left. And I thought a lot about that, and thought about how I wanted to have a kind of teaching that wasn't critical, that wasn't about evaluation and workshop, but was about growing and creating, which is the part that interests me. So I was always looking for opportunities to teach that way. I did seek them out myself. So, for example, I did teach for the first time, aged very young, hadn't published a great deal, at the City Lit in London. And then I had that Doncaster writer in residence role, and that involved me doing community teaching, so to minors and their partners, their wives, people with Down syndrome, people with, I don't know, a whole range of community groups. I've taught every kind of community group, from those who have so adult lack of literacy, not sure what that's called now, but that's what we used to call it back in 87. Basic people who didn't read or write, but we could do poetry kind of orally. And what it really taught me was I had to develop a methodology that would work with everyone. And that is why I have a particular style of teaching, which is about generating. I cannot assume that everybody has a PhD in English literature. So I cannot reference intertextuality or whatever it might be without putting off half the people or making people feel stupid. So I've always wanted to have a more inclusive style that valued what people were doing. And when I taught at UEA, you know, it was possible up to a point, but in an academic setting, it has its limitations. So more and more, I enjoyed things like teaching for the Arvon Foundation, which is residential, where people go away for a week, and all kinds of people, all different abilities and levels. Wonderful. I highly recommend the Arvon Foundation. And then I've been doing teaching for things like The Guardian, the Faber Academy, and recently the Times. And since the advent of the lockdown, of course, I've discovered Zoom like everyone else, and I've realized that Zoom really suits me. It suits my style. Because what I always want to share is the kind of intimacy of writing and the privacy, and the fact that I don't think it should be shared and read aloud and critiqued immediately. To me, it's like a souffle. Well, I said this once, I'm not a great cook, and people said, oh no, you can double cook a souffle. But anyway, that you open the oven and it flops. So I think if writing's shown too soon, that's exactly what happens. It just, you know, it kind of collapses. So I much prefer the idea of writing remaining quite a private endeavour, but you can share that with Zoom and people can be writing together, if you see what I mean. So the new course, launched today as it happens, is called Dive In. You can find it on my website. I was going to call it Novel in a Year, but that's a book by my good friend Louise Doughty, and I think it was a bit cheeky of me. So mine is kind of Novel in 10 months. And dive in is a phrase I use an awful lot. You know, when people say, what's the best time to write? Should you do a lot of research first? Should you? No, get on, dive in. You know, I'm always saying that. So it's a course of webinars, monthly webinars, which provide deadlines to try to keep people writing and get people writing, if you like. So it's for those who might have an idea for a novel, or it's for those who have written perhaps other books, but not a novel before, or it might be for someone who's on their 5th novel, but wants the structure of someone saying, come on, keep going. And what about this week? And it does involve an agent, Q&A with an agent, and probably some guests as time goes on. So that's Dive In. The other thing, I probably will do more Times courses, maybe not the Guardian ones. I did those for a while. You sort of kind of exhaust, it feels to me sometimes, or the writing, there has to be some, a bit like the management of time, there has to be some management of energy. And I kind of think, well, I've repeated myself, oh, I've done that one, so I'll move here and do something else. So that's also what goes on. Gold Dust is one-to-one mentoring, where we match up new writers with, you know, well-known ones such as Andrew Miller, as I mentioned, or Tim Pears, or Louise Doughty, or I think there's about 18 of them, tons of people. And I think more and more places are doing mentoring. I see a new one popping up all the time. But when I started that was not such a common idea. And so it was very hard for people to know if I wanted, let's say, to be taught by Jane Rogers. I mean, I did my MA in Sheffield Hallam to be taught by Jane Rogers. But actually, she now mentors for us. So I could have Jane all to myself and wouldn't have to share her with the other students, which is what the mentoring is, in effect, you know. So that was the model I wanted, and that's why I set that up.
Fantastic, thank you. And I love the idea of this model that gives that structural support and motivation, but also respecting the privacy, as you were saying, and that kind of, I don't know, internalization of the writing process. Wonderful. I think, so I really wanted to ask some questions about going back from teaching and from publication back to the beginning of the blank page of the writing process, a little bit about that. And that might feed into Geneva's question in the chat as well. The question I wanted to ask was, so when you mentioned in your talk about the blank days and the joy of the free day, of that open time. When you're facing the free day, do you have a set structure or routine that gets you writing? And I wonder if that might also feed into, in some way, to Geneva's question, which was about whether you have a way of capturing ideas on the go, so when you notice things, and if you do. So this is quite a few questions all at once, isn't it, actually? But if you do, how do you then make sure your notes are enough that you'll understand them later? Like, how much would you write?
Great. And which one to start with? I always have the same pattern, which is I do a bit of yoga first. I mean, I think stretches or any similar thing would wake up the body, because it's a very, very, you just sat there, aren't you, all day long? So it seems to me something that moves you is quite useful. But also yoga is very quieting. So the equivalent would just be to sit quietly, doing some deep breathing. And I never have found it difficult to get started. I would say that that's one of the techniques I want to share with Dive In when I do the course, which is, it's because I'm sure I give myself absolute permission to write whatever I want, and also to write badly. There's no sense in which it has to be polished or good or anyone's going to see it. There's just that feeling that I'm just writing. So that would be, I'm not musical particularly, but you know, if you were just strumming the guitar without the pressure to perform a brilliant song. And then from that, usually something comes. And I would say that my understanding of teaching creative writing, and the things I've tried to say that might be particular to my beliefs, is I think your own judgment is a very big part of that. So not the endless seeking critical evaluation by others. And to me, that development comes by being with yourself and reading your work over and over yourself. So I love this Toni Morrison quote about teaching creative writing, where she says, teaching it is teaching writers to read their own work properly. So basically to understand what you're doing and to look for what you're doing. And just to give an example of that, in one of my early short stories, had quite a heavy-handed editor. And she kept, as I'm only 28 or whatever, she was older, 40 probably at the Women's Press, much more senior and all the rest of it. And she kept trying to iron something out of me that I couldn't yet do. And I knew it was there and I knew I couldn't do it yet, but I wanted it. Now I'm so much older, I understand utterly that I was going for a very particular deadpan tone. And she kept trying to unify it, if you like, and make it sound more fluid, and you can understand why. But I was struggling with a sort of ear to find a tone I wanted. So I kind of think I had to do that by myself. I had to understand that in my own writing. I know exactly what I mean by that now. And when I read something I've done, I know when the voice feels right and when I've got what I want. But I was young then and couldn't do it yet. But the trouble is that people can intervene too early, especially to normalize you or standardize you if you are trying to do something that is clumsy, which I think it was at that point. So as a mentor or teacher, I'm always aware that imposition is quite easy. You can, you know, impose your style or your syntax or your voice if you're not careful. And I think in groups that often happens, a consensus, a groupthink is arrived at. And so anything that's a bit clumsy, edgy, uncomfortable, not there yet, can be ironed out. And yet often that's where the energy is. So I've really learned to sit with my own early drafts. I'm disappointed by them. I wish they were better, but I don't beat myself up over them. I look at them, I look for what's alive, is how I think of it in them. And I can usually work with that. I spend a lot of time kind of puzzling over what's driving me, you know, long before I let anyone else suggest what's driving me. So that's why the private thinking and writing feels to me important. That's my routine. As for the second question, the notebook one, brilliant. I mean, interestingly, I know people do it on their phone, take notes on their phone, but I do like a good old-fashioned notebook, and I've got tons of them. And I am a bit poor at finding again what I want very often, but I think it kind of doesn't matter. I value the rough notebook, and in the teaching I do, I often talk about going on a walk as a way to start your novel and just making notes on what you see and thinking about what your character would think of that. And so I've got billions of notebooks full of that kind of stuff, of which I might end up using one phrase, but I do think they're quite precious and sort of rich tools for producing writing.
Great, thank you. And actually, we have a question that's just come in the chat, which connects to that, given that you were just talking about the privacy in the process and finding your own voice. We've had a question from the ARU dot that says, to what extent do you think that a successful novelist has his or her own recognizable voice in narrative? Or can they be a successful novelist, be a chameleon in this regard?
Yeah, I think that some writers can only do their own voice, if you like. So if you think of someone like, don't know if this is fair for Julian Barnes, but say Martin Amis, he's unmistakably Martin Amis. You can't imagine Martin Amis being able to do a barely literate 9-year-old girl. I've never seen him write like that. Whereas I'd imagine that Michael Ondaatje could. So I would, of the two styles of writing, either having your own distinctive voice that is always there, or being able to inhabit a voice. I'm very much more in that camp. And that's what I love to do. So I have got a novel, The Telltale Heart, which is 3 male voices. One a 16-year-old boy from the Fens, one a 18th century Fen rioter, and one a very kind of urbane, cynical 50-year-old contemporary man. And I would hope that all of them sound like they should, like a character. That's my pleasure in voice, in often subsuming mine and creating one the way an actor does, or a ventriloquist. But it doesn't mean I don't enjoy writers who have a hugely distinctive voice. I mean, I have written about Highsmith, Patricia Highsmith, and I think you always know when you're in a Highsmith novel, it's very, very plot driven, very kind of compelling, moves fast, very few reflective moments. One reviewer described it as relentless as a dull headache. So I think there is some truth in that in Highsmith's style, but it's kind of addictive. And I would say she has that very prominent voice throughout. So my answer to that is, you know, either. I can admire either, but I think they're different things. I just would add, though, that sometimes I have thought that, I mean, I think things have really changed, but when I was first publishing, and it was the era of the big male writers like Amis, Barnes, and not sure who else, but that was much more admired, if you like, was that, well, Ian McEwan, you know, again, it's a kind of male educated voice. You can't imagine him doing a working class girl from the Fens as a voice. But again, I could imagine Michael Ondaatje doing it because I think he can do anything. He's one of my favourite writers. So we have different aims, I think, and value different things.
Yeah, they're beautifully put. And actually, what you were saying about inhabiting voices, that leads on to one more question that I very much wanted to ask, which is, that many of your works focus on historical persons, and you do inhabit their voice. You imagine and inhabit their voice. How do you decide who and what to write about? And also, I wondered if you could say a bit more. You mentioned a reading day in your week, but I wondered if you could say a bit more about the research that you go into your historical subjects.
Yes, it's very hard to find a voice for a historical subject. I think especially given that many times the voice I want is not an educated person. So for example, in The Great Lover, there's a lot about Rupert Brooke, but there's also a voice of Nell, who's just the maid. And that's where you'll find the least evidence. You know, nobody's collating documents, letters, or things that she might, or a girl like her, let's say, might have written. So one of the gifts for me in Fred and Edie was there were letters existing that I could use, written by Edith Thompson, so I could get a sense of her voice, and I would read them over and over and over until I could feel as if I could kind of replicate them and then mix them up. And I was very gratified in that novel and The Great Lover, where reviewers sometimes got it wrong. I remember in the Brooke novel, you know, people saying, oh, Dawson quotes Brooke and it was a bit of me, you know, and then kind of just mixing it up. So that's my joy, if you like, is to get it so that it's so inside me that I feel as if I can just splurge it out. But that's about voice, a historical voice that I might be looking for. The research itself is just a huge enterprise and a hugely, to me, pleasurable one, very not separate from the writing. I understand that lots of novelists don't do research and don't wish to, but I do it even for the contemporary novels or for the novels that aren't based on true stories. There's something like 6 of them are and 5 of them aren't. Just because I find that being either reading or visiting somewhere, mainly visiting, going somewhere, is what will produce the writing for me. Almost walking the walk is what does it. So if it's at all possible to physically go somewhere, I mean, the Fen novel, the Telltale Heart, it's partly about the Little Port rioters, and I walked over and over the territory, really, of where they would have gone to try to sort of feel my way into it, a bit like method acting or something. I find that really just hugely enjoyable. And I think the danger of research is that it should, and sometimes is, just very flat. You know, if you do too much of it on the internet, you don't get the sensory experience, you don't get the smells and the textures. So I do warn my students not to just only rely on that kind of research, although you need it as well, of course. And then just one other thing, which is, I'm sometimes shocked. I suppose I did do American studies, so I did do history as part of that. When my mentees don't understand the difference really between a primary document and a secondary source. And of course, I'm looking for primary sources if I can find them, letters or memoirs, or, you know, go to a museum, see a scrap of a child's shoe, feels to me a more vivid way to get information than read someone else's book about a particular time. And I do sort of find often my mentees have relied too much on one book without being conscious of, you know, issues of, I don't know, plagiarism or relying too much on one person's research. So I do very widely research, and if possible, I'll even go to places. I went to Texas, where Highsmith grew up, because both of her biographers mentioned that a lot of her early years were a bit more mysterious, 0 to 6. So I wanted to go there to where she was from 0 to 6. And actually, I did have the most fantastic couple of experiences. So I did feel as if it was very valuable to go there, even though perhaps others might not.
Oh, thank you. And I can see it's really interesting as you were talking about primary sources and secondary sources. I can see how, as you say, an over-reliance on secondary sources could really cloud that creative effort of inhabiting voice. And I really love how you were stressing the sensory nature of visiting places, and really interesting. A lot of parallels have come up with acting, actually, over our conversation. So that method acting parallel and that conversation around the agent as well, and the relationship you have with your agent. Very interesting. There is time, just speaking to the audience, if anyone has a question, we do have time for one further question.
Let me put that website in that I promised.
One question I'd like to ask just for fun, because I can't resist, is out of the people you researched, out of these historical figures, who would you most like to meet?
Oh, well,
Curious
it's
about.
funny, long ago when the Rupert Brooke novel was out, The Great Lover, I did an event in Cambridge, and my friend Midge Gillies, some of you might know her, biographer, was in the audience, and she said a slightly different version of that, which was, I think only a biographer would ask this question, did I ever dream of Rupert Brooke? And interestingly, when I'm working on someone, I do dream about them. So I have dreamt about him, and I have dreamt about Patricia Highsmith. And I have dreamt about my current character, who's wholly made up, who's called Martha. And when I'm working on a novel, I would very much love to meet them. They feel very vivid to me. But interestingly, by the time the readers get the novel, so by the time the book comes out, I think we often forget that the writer finished it a year before or whatever. So my energy is usually moved somewhere else at that point. My energy is always in the creative project. You know, not there's a publicity you have to do for your book, and it can be quite hard because you've sort of forgotten what you were even thinking about when you were writing it. So I would love to meet Brooke or Highsmith. People have often asked me, do I think Highsmith would like what I've done with her? And she's famously solitary, grumpy, difficult. There was a fantastic Radio 4 Great Lives on her recently by Andrew Wilson, her biographer, who's become a friend because I needed to get to know him because I was using a lot of his research materials. So I needed his permission and for him to be okay with that. But on this programme, they did say that Highsmith was shy rather than odd. And that is, in a way, how I have thought of her, very extremely shy, for sure. But I think it's an affectionate portrait. So my sense there is that possibly she might like what I have done, which was also to give her her due as a writer of note, you know, not, I think we're forgetting because she has been a bit rehabilitated lately, and Highsmith is very much on people's, you know, radar. They remember that she wrote Strangers on a Train or Two Faces of January, as well as Carol, or, you know, but at the point when I started that book, that wasn't quite true. And I did want to draw people's attention to how good her early works are in particular. So I didn't really answer that, both of them.
Oh, no, you did. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we've got time for just one more question. I can see that Cheryl Grayson has put in the chat. Should you write about what you want or what you think would get published?
It's such an easy one, that one. You've got to write what you want. You can't second guess the market. Writing any novel is a long project. So at the end of, let's say, 2 years of writing, a further year of waiting, and then a year of publicizing, I need to still be in love with the subject I chose. So simply writing something because you think it would get published, I think is a mistake. And much more relevant, really, is what I said at the very beginning about what is it you're going to do with your one wild and precious life, which is, you know, this is an opportunity to say something that matters and tell a truth or tell your own story in a way that matters to you. So I would take that opportunity rather than worry about the market.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. And I just want to say again, thank you so much for this inspiring and uplifting motivational talk, this wonderful conversation, for answering all our questions so beautifully. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Kathy.
It's been a pleasure. Oh, and Cheryl's also written, thank you for reminding me of good young women's magazines of the past year.
You're welcome. Thank you all. And I hope to see you again at some other future event.
Oh, yeah, I hope so, definitely. Thank you.